Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes.
Is it true that people in Africa are poor? Hey, sorry, I'm talking to you.
Sorry, do you have £10 there, please? Could you lend me £10?
Oh, no, I don't have money.
Oh, you don't have money?
No.
And you are busy looking for poor people?
Oh, well.
My message today goes to the youth of Africa. Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said that he who remains neutral in situations of injustice has chosen the side of the oppressor. When the foot of the elephant is on the tail of the mouse, and you tell the mouse that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Africa has been confronted with injustice for a very long period of time, and we cannot afford to remain neutral and afford to remain silent about the happenings in our very own continent. Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah once said, and I quote, that Africa is rich and not poor.
Africa is rich and not poor.
Africa has immense actual and potential wealth: gold, diamonds, manganese, bauxite, iron ore, uranium, cobalt, and a host of other minerals. Our essential agricultural produce have been drained by colonialist and imperialist governments. Africa is far from being poor. It is Africans who are poor and not Africa. And Africans are poor because of the uncounted profits that have been exploited from their labor and from their lands. End of quote. Today in Africa, we are confronted with an Africa which, in the words of former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, has become a scar on the conscience of humanity. We are confronted with an Africa today which is indeed the richest continent on earth. We have gold, but we don't have good roads. We have diamonds, but we have deplorable health systems. We have bauxite, we have timber, we have manganese. And yet, our rural areas in Africa do not even have potable drinking water. Some parts of our cities do not even have potable drinking water. This is the Africa that we are confronted with. We are confronted today with an Africa where our young men and women have no pride and they have no interest in Africa. When they want to enjoy themselves, they prefer to sing the praises of football teams from Europe and America. It is Manchester United, it's Arsenal, it's Real Madrid and Barcelona, not House of Oak, not Kotoko. No, not Brecum Chelsea. This is the Africa with which we are confronted with. Not very long ago, over 400 Africans drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, around the island of Lampedusa. Why? Because they were running away from Africa. Not so long ago, a group of Africans also drowned next to the island of Malta because they were running away from Africa. Today in Africa, we are confronted with a situation where Africans are seen wailing and kicking as they seek to enslave themselves in Europe and America. Contrary to the colonial era where Africans were taken away to be enslaved, today our young men and women, we want to enslave ourselves in Europe and America. This is the tragedy with which we are confronted with today. We are confronted today with an Africa where if a ship comes from Europe or the United States, or a plane comes to any of our airports, Kotoka International Airport of Ghana, or indeed any country in Africa, and asks the young men and women, how many of you would want to be enslaved in Europe and America? How many of you would want to escape this continent? Our young men and women will kill and probably kill themselves so that they can escape this continent. This is the tragedy with which we are confronted with. Because Africans today have no self-pride. Our young men and women have no love, have no interest, have no passion for their own continent. They see no potential, they see no future in our very own continent. Ladies and gentlemen, why must we constantly remind ourselves of these realities? Because throughout the ages, the battle has always been the battle of the mind. And if your mind is conquered, if Africans, our minds are conquered, then we are going nowhere. And no wonder in the ages of enlightenment, the great René Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. And therefore, if we as Africans, we are to begin to make any meaningful contribution in our own affairs, if we as Africans are to sit on the same dinner table of equality with Europe and America, if we as Africans are to reduce or bring to extinction the dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty in Africa, then we as Africans must begin to think. But the question is, are we thinking? Indeed, are we thinking? We have universities in their numbers. Ghana has universities including KNUST, UDS, Legon, UCC. Nigeria has universities as indeed South Africa, as indeed Rwanda, as indeed Congo and Togo, and indeed all countries in Africa. We have engineers that we have trained. But when we want to build our roads, it's the Chinese who are present here in this assembly who are building our roads. And so we have engineers who cannot make roads. We have educational system in this country, a free educational system in many countries in Africa. And yet, in the words of P.L.O. Lumumba, it is free indeed, free of knowledge. Because we are so suspicious of those institutions that the typical African politician will not dare take their children to those schools. Their children would rather be educated in the British system, in the American system. Not because there is anything wrong with those institutions, but the agenda is wrong. Because, in the words of P.L.O. Lumumba, our leaders long lost the script and ought to be described for who they are, our misleaders. And notwithstanding, Africans, we are co-authors of our own misfortune. Because whenever Africans are given the opportunity to elect our leaders, what we do in Africa is that we elect thieves. We elect hyenas and wolves to take care of the goats. And when the goats are consumed, we wonder why. Africa has indeed become a tragic continent. Young men and women in Africa, it is time that we begin to take our destinies into our own hands and begin to forge towards a better Africa. An Africa that will be free from the dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty. It is time that we begin to think about the socio-economic development of our continent. And our leaders must begin to have a change of mind and a change of heart. After the coronavirus came and many countries began to lock down their borders, that is when the realities began to dawn on us here in Africa. Because in Africa, our leaders steal from us and they save the monies in Swiss banks, in European banks, and build fortresses and homes abroad, whilst the larger population is languishing in poverty, cannot afford even 3 square meals a day. Unemployment is increasing day in and day out. This is the Africa with which we are confronted with. And therefore, it can be done. And it must start with the young men and women in Africa having a conscious effort to change the system in which we live, to ensure that the development of our continent is our topmost priority. And I believe that it can be done, and it must be done, and it should be done, because if it is not done, we are done. Thank you.